Welcome to the entrustED podcast. Today's episode is entitled Grits, Grace, and Mercy. You may be wondering, what in the world is that? Well, my next guest, Kirk Leday, and I have a tremendous connection on a few fronts, and this episode hits home for both of us. For those who don't know, GRITS is also an acronym, not just for Southern food, but it's an acronym that stands for Girls Raised in the South. I was raised in coastal South Carolina. Kirk was born in Louisiana. And while he isn't a girl, he sure knows what Southern living is all about. And we both love to cook, and we're geeks on the same foodie group. Grits is often on there. We both have been head of human resources in our career journey. But let me tell you a little more about Kirk. While he was born in Louisiana, he moved to Chicago with his family when he was young, making him a huge White Sox and Chicago Bears fan. And after graduating from Knox College, he received a commission in the Army and later entered education, becoming both a teacher and a coach. As his career progressed, his leadership did too, and he continued to shine, and he was recruited for school administration, eventually becoming a high school principal, and I like to still tell him he is a recovering high school principal. And after that, he journeyed into human resources, where he eventually became chief of staff to an organization with over 1,000 employees. When you're in charge of human resources in a school district, there are two things that should make up your North Star. One is that you're the guardian of the children. You have to make sure people working with students are of the highest caliber, and they have the best skills and resources that they can have in order to develop young people. The second part of that North Star as a human resources executive is you are also the conscience of the school district. There are days when you have to make tough decisions for the best interest of the organization and the students. And you also have to have compassion and empathy for the personnel in whatever circumstance or challenge they may be going through on a personal or a professional level. There are days when you have to look at supervisors and tell them, you can't do that. Integrity is the number one character trait for all of those reasons. So back to our title, Grits, Grace, and Mercy. Grits is more than just a play on words. You need to have grit as a leader. Being a human resources chief of staff is more than just recruitment and hiring. It's more than just training. It is so much more and often less than glamorous. Sometimes you have to make the tough decisions, and sometimes because humans do mess up, you might find yourself extending grace and mercy. And let me tell you this, those two terms do not mean the same thing. So welcome, Kirk. Thank you for being with us on the entrustED podcast. And we've had many conversations, and this is just another one of those. And hopefully we have people who are aspiring leaders who are listening or watching today. And we also have people who are existing leaders in their jobs, but maybe thinking about their next step or just need some inspiration for taking on these huge jobs that we all have.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just say back to the Southern thing. When I moved from Louisiana to Chicago and I started elementary school there, I always thought I was going to grow up to be a comedian because everybody in the class told me I talk funny. And so I had to take some speech classes in order to unsouthernized me to become acclimated to the Chicago climate. So I always thought I was going to be a comedian because I was told I talked funny.
Funny, different words, right? They mean the same thing. Okay, so we just have some topics I think we can just roll through that we've probably talked about 100 times. But the first thing is, there's also joy in this work. We know it's tough work.
Yep.
But there's a lot of joy, and I just want to know, tell us what you find is joyful in your work.
Okay. What I find to be joyful is knowing that you're making a difference, that you can have a direct impact on the lives of students, their families, for staff members, knowing that you have some input into some systemic decisions about how things go.
Yeah. And I think, when you see those first teachers on the first day of school, when you have that opening day, whatever that is, that's always exciting. I know, because you see the fruits of the work from the previous spring with all that recruitment and hiring. Do you have any good stories about recruiting and hiring?
Well, I have a one that was really great. I think I was at Illinois State University, and I interviewed a young man. And throughout the entire interview, I kept looking down, and he had a nice, crisp blue suit on, but I could see something hanging down. And I didn't want to say anything. So after the interview, because there were other people waiting, I leaned over to him and I was like, "Hey, you forgot to take the tag off your jacket." And he said, "No, I didn't. I'm going to take this suit back."
Well, I know not really a funny recruiting story, but an awkward one. For me, one time was when I actually saw a candidate stand in front of our recruiting table, and it was actually someone we had released the year before. And as soon as our eyes met, she knew she was probably in the wrong line, and I certainly wanted to go under the tables. You can't make it up, right?
No, there's a million of them. I did another one years later. And there was a gentleman who was looking for some work, and he was blind. And so I was trying to help him understand how he could go through our process of filling out an application and things. And so when we got done, I made the mistake and I just said, "Hey, keep an eye out on our website and you'll see some jobs posted." I didn't feel real good about that one.
Yeah, that was rough. We probably have enough content to just write a book about things you can't make up in human resources,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely.
So, one of the things that I know we also deal with is mistakes versus sins. A lot of times educators or personnel in a school district, not all of them are teachers certainly, or leaders,
Sure.
but sometimes people just mess up. I don't think people start out in the morning going to work hoping that they're going to mess up the district that day, but somehow we're human and we trip over something. So talk a little bit about that. There's a difference between mistakes and sins.
Yeah, I generally look at mistakes are something that people obviously did not pre-plan to do. So it was not a premeditated thing. It was kind of an accident. We have those all the time where sometimes our bus drivers may clip a car in the parking lot as they try to turn a very, very tight corner. That's a mistake. An egregious sin would be intentionally, and I'll use some examples that fortunately haven't happened for us, but I hear that have happened in other places where a driver might come to work under the influence.
Mm-hmm.
That was an intentional decision that we're not able to extend as much grace to, as opposed to you're driving a bus and you clip a car because you have to make a tight turn.
Yeah, so it's the difference of can't versus won't, maybe sometimes
Could
too.
be.
So it could be a training issue
Oh,
or
absolutely.
something like that too, I think. Yeah, one time when I was superintendent, one of the grounds guys, he ran right into my car. Do you remember that one?
Yes, I do.
A better one than that, though, is when I was head of human resources, and I was rushing to a meeting, and so I was getting out of the parking lot at the office, and I backed right into the union president's car. That was that was me eating a little bit of crow that day and feeling kind of bad. But those things happen. We're all human, and those are mistakes. I think in human resources work, though, when we do come across something that has been a willful and wanton situation, that breaks my heart because we invest a lot in people when we hire them. I mean, what kind of monetary investment do you think organizations put into people, like on a dollar amount, maybe.
Well, if you were to take, let's just use a licensed teacher, for example, and where our salary schedule is, and if you consider a 25 to 30-year career, you're going to invest in salaries and benefits. That doesn't include any additional training of a couple of $1 million that you're investing in that particular individual. So giving grace is something that we want to do. For example, when we think of discipline, the same as we do with students. Discipline shouldn't necessarily be always punitive. It's about correcting an action or correcting a sin.
Yep.
But some of those things that are willful and wanton would involve, some severe discipline, unfortunately.
Yeah. How do you use the association? I know you have 2 unions.
Yep.
How do you work with their leadership in terms of some of this training or information for people?
Okay. Well, the first thing in relationships with associations, you have to work to build a relationship. In an ideal world, you have conversations about the betterment of the organization, that everybody's pulling on the same side of the rope. We are all aware that, associations they're going to do things to increase and enhance their membership, and no school district is necessarily opposed to that. But as long as we have some of the same goals in mind, what are we doing to make the workforce better, which ultimately will improve educational outcome for children? Then I think, we can have a good coexisting relationship.
Yeah, we've all been through those cycles together, right? You think about contract negotiations, you think about compensation and benefits. And I know it's always your goal. It certainly was always mine that we do the very, very best we can for our people who serve our children and our community every day. But a lot of it depends on leadership there too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Again, it goes back to that relationship and having an understanding that, yes, we do have common goals. This is where we align. As you mentioned, heck, when you started there, you were the first district, certainly in Colorado, to start at the 40K, 80K. And that took a considerable amount of collaboration with the association. And at that time, it appeared that, hey, we're all pulling on the same end of the rope. We can give a little bit, we can gain a little bit. And those are very, very healthy labor relationships that we had.
Yeah, and I think there have been times when, the relationships have been strained, maybe because there was a change in leadership with the association. I'll tell you, whoever's president of the association makes huge difference.
Absolutely.
In terms of working with them. I know that, and I know you feel that, daily. I mean, aren't you on the phone pretty much constantly?
At least 5 or 6 times a day. Yeah. And as long as the association president keeps grounded in understanding what the mission of a school district is, I think there are always ways that you can solve labor issues. Unfortunately, as you said, sometimes when there is a change in leadership, and sometimes people who assume those positions will listen to the loud vocal few and then assume that something in the labor relationship is not going the way that it should be, where a union leader who understands what the mission is, because sometimes, you have to tell your constituency, hey, that's not for the betterment of all.
Right. I think even with people who are aspiring principals, maybe folks who are listening, so one of the things that folks have to remember is this: even though squeaky wheels sometimes get the grease, right? That's what you're talking about. The loudest voices don't necessarily speak for everybody. I think systems work really well about 80% of the time. There's always going to be these outliers and these exceptions. But if you have a system working well in your building or in your department, 80% of the time, that's a pretty good system. And so if you are paying attention to the squeaky wheels, the ones who are speaking the loudest, if you're not careful, you'll fix something that's systemic for everybody.
Sure.
And not just that particular situation.
Sure.
Talk about that, because I know that's something that you come across all the time.
Well, absolutely. When you're dealing with, again, labor relations, sometimes there may just be a particular individual or an individual circumstance that may or may not warrant any kind of attention. If you go and then you make a systemic change because of the lack of information that you have, you can really do some severe damage to your organization as far as the culture goes. Most people would say, why did we have to change from what we're doing? Because it was working really well. Whereas you said, maybe you got a silent 10% or a vocal 20% that want something changed, which may not benefit the entire organization. And that's when labor relations really become strained.
Yeah. You also have, I think for the first time in history, I mean, I read this in a book not too long ago, we have 6 generations on these campuses now. 6 generations.
Yeah.
And not to overgeneralize, but every generation has some characteristics. How are you dealing with Gen Z folks at this point in time?
Well, what I can say honestly is that I'm learning.
Yeah.
Because I don't have all the answers. I've gone through a couple of workshops. I got some research. And actually at our last Human Resources staff meeting, I shared some general characteristics that researchers have put out about different generations. And it's just so that we understand each other. Doesn't necessarily make one generation better or one generation worse than the other. It's just that we have different values and things. I can go back to being a little boy and the older generation. I can remember hearing them frequently say, boy, that generation is really messed up. They're going to ruin our country because kids had long hair and they wore bell bottoms.
Yeah.
And it seemed to turn out okay. So we just have to be able to learn. We have to give grace, as you said, and realize that things are just a little different. Doesn't necessarily always mean poor.
Yeah, I think one of the things that got me, I mean, I was raised by the veteran generation, right? You know, they respected authority, you know, all the things. They went to work in one place and stayed for so many years, I mean, over generations. And I think it was when the millennials showed up in the workforce, that was the first time it really hit home, not even the boomers, but the millennials, that they wanted their life and their work life both. It was a different work ethic or a different balance in that work ethic, and also not staying in one place for very long. So I know we've looked at things like portability of benefits for that very reason. You know, someone may make a job change or a district change or a career change to another industry. How have you felt that in terms of retention?
Well, I just read something not too long ago that the younger generations, on average, they're going to have 5 to 7 career changes during the course of their lifetime. So what can we do as an organization to first encourage them to come and work with us? And then second, what can we do to try and address some of the things that they said that they need? And one of the things, you remember this because you were instrumental in getting it going off the ground, was they're very, very interested in their mental health. And it's not that any other generation isn't interested in their mental health, but that's a primary thing that they said that are important to them. So we created a new position in the district, and we've done a lot of mental health first aid with all of our staff members. And this was more of a focus on the individual. How do we help you become a successful whole individual? Therefore, you can do well for students.
Yeah, so a whole wellness emphasis, I guess, in human resources that we didn't used to have, because you don't know what's walking through the door. I mean, let's circle back to COVID.
That's not.
No, but I mean, mean, we all still have the scars from some of that work, right?
Yep.
Especially, getting into in-person schooling again. And I know your district was the first one to go back in the metropolitan area.
Yeah.
That was a very controversial time, and there were lots of things changing daily. And I think we're glad that's in the rearview mirror now. But talk about some of those things that you had to just let go of and change.
Sure. Well, one thing, just commenting on the overall change, we were dealing with something that no one had ever, that we knew living, had ever had to deal with. So we were not sure of how deadly this virus was or if it was not. And we had to make some decisions based upon that, but being courageous enough to say, we're going to go back with precautions into the school. So because that was what was best for our children was a really courageous decision. Looking back on it, this is the first time I'd never even heard the term like remote learning, and suddenly having to switch or pivot and now have staff members have online instruction, which probably none of us had ever been prepared for, was another huge challenge. And so incrementally, we learned some things. I believe we got better as we attempted to navigate that, but none of it could ever take the place of being in person with students.
Yeah, our kids needed us for sure during those times more than ever, because a lot of kids, their parents were first responders or working, and they were left at home to deal with that remote learning.
Sure.
On their own a lot of times. So having them in person, even with the mask mandates and with all the other things and the space, I just remember having to go through so many hoops, to make sure we were in line with the health department about in-person learning. And like if someone was exposed before the vaccine was out, we would have to send them home. Well, there goes a teacher for 10 days. And, we had to have substitutes to change that. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah. The traditional way that we had done substitutes had been, you generally had people who were retired or who just had some time on their hand, and they would substitute in a class most times whenever we need it. But with COVID, you couldn't consistently cross-contaminate and have people going from one building to another. So hence we started doing what we would call full-time subs. And we were just hiring a person or persons that would be in one particular site to minimize the possible exposure, so you didn't necessarily have to close down multiple schools if a school became infected at that time.
And is it something you kept as far as your strategy for substitutes? Because they're always in high demand.
Yes, we do have our full-time subs, and we have them assigned to different schools. We've worked real diligently to try to find some part-time subs, but in a labor market such as it is, it's really difficult to find.
Well, in the labor market, let's talk about that for a second, because that pipeline for growing leaders, that's something you've also had to address.
Yep.
I know, because there's a teacher shortage. There's no question about that. And so how do we get more candidates who are quality candidates into a candidate pool? But if you think that's a shortage, the leadership shortage is really out there too. In fact, that's a whole focus of this podcast, is trying to lift people up and encourage and create a pipeline for leaders, especially in education.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we did, and we're not unlike a lot of places across the country, you look first at your own workforce and see what's the interest and what opportunities can you have for developing some of our paraprofessionals who want to move into the teaching ranks. Then it becomes paramount now with the competition among school districts to build good, positive relationships with universities so you get first crack at some of the student teachers. At Regis University, we have a very strong partnership with them, as with Metro and others. And when we are able to get those student teachers into us, we've created a stipend for them. So we give them money because we realize that they have to get to and from work, and they have to pay gas or pay some bills. And we just try to do everything we possibly can to help support them in their journey. And it gives us first opportunity to try and hire those folks.
Yeah.
It's also critical that we build and continue to strengthen relationships with universities across the country, because gone are the days where you could go to a university and sit down and interview 100 young people.
Yeah, the line out the door, right?
Yeah.
That's a thing of the past.
Yeah, we're lucky if you can go there and sometimes talk to 5 young people. So figuring out other avenues to reach out and get candidates. And you were infamous for saying, hey, we're all recruiters in the district.
Yeah,
so,
everybody. I'll be recruiting.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
right. It's everybody. Sometimes it is just that word of mouth, and that's all it takes to have someone get interested, in the school district or something like that.
Sure.
Well, maybe let's switch gears for a second. There's a lot of less than glamorous work in HR too.
Sure.
And I know you have a terrific team, a terrific staff who works with you. But what are some of those challenges, Kirk, that HR people wrestle with all the time?
I think one of the primary challenges is, by the sheer nature of what we do, you can't talk to anybody about it.
Yeah.
And so, the perception can sometimes be that you're working in isolation, that you're working in a silo, that people in the field aren't aware of what's going on. And most times it's because there are some legal ramifications around some of the decisions or things that we have to do. And we can't just go broadcast that.
Yeah. I used to tease some of my colleagues and say, HR people, it's like going to a cocktail party with a bunch of gynecologists. What are they going to talk about? Nothing. But just like HR
Sure.
people, you can't talk about anything that's personnel related. Because you're right, people have rights. Even if there's a disciplinary thing going on, these people still have rights.
Sure.
But yet, sometimes people can go to the media and they can tell their side of a story, and it puts, I know, you and the organization in a tough, sticky wicket.
Yep.
To say the least.
Yep.
Right. There have been a few of those situations.
Unfortunately, there are some. And what is probably the most frustrating part is that we can't even comment. So if there's an accusation leveled, we have to just kind of grin and bear it.
I know that there are landmines that new leaders often fall into. Can you think of any of those, and maybe some advice you would have for people who are thinking about getting into leadership, or even people who are in current leadership roles?
Sure. The first thing I would always say is, no matter what you've learned kind of on the instructional side of the house or on the operational side of the house, it still always comes down to, it is a people business. And so you could have the greatest idea in the world, but if you can't get people to follow that vision or implement that, then it goes to waste. And I think sometimes what I've observed are a lot of our new leaders are so focused on technical skills that they sometimes miss the boat. And that boat is, hey, you're working with human beings, and human beings rely on interpersonal relations.
Organizational development and organizational culture is also squarely in the Office of Human Resources, because human capital is our greatest asset, our greatest resource. What about advice in creating a positive organizational culture?
Okay. What I would always talk with our young leaders about is what's called situational awareness, and understanding how things operate. Basically, I don't want to say undercover, but how does it function? And the way that you learn those is just by observing. If you were new coming into an organization, the most important advice I could give someone is, hey, learn what people are doing. Keep a notebook. Find out those things. ask a few questions. Why do you do something this particular way? Not with the necessarily intent to change something, but so that you understand. I have a story when I first became principal, and I watched my assistant principals for, I would say, 2 months. I just would go in while they were doing lunch duty, and they would all stand at the end of the line, and they would just hand a kid the milk. And I just watched and never questioned it. And then finally, after a couple months, I started asking the question. I said, okay, can you explain to me why you do that? And one of my assistant principals said, well, because the kids are only entitled to get one milk. And so I let it go for a while, and I said, well, why don't you put the milk behind the counter? And it's something that people probably never really thought about, but someone coming in right away would have said, hey, that's a dumb idea, let's get that changed, without giving yourself an opportunity to kind of learn why people would do that. And I said, what's the problem? Well, we don't want kids to take more than one milk. So I said a solution to that is we get some building funds from selling sodas and Gatorades and other things. And I said, well, how about if we simply put some money in a kitty, so to speak, and if a kid wants 2 milks, they get 2 milks.
2 milks, right?
And, problem solved. And then I was able to use our human capital in a better way for the positions that they held.
Yeah, when you look at their hourly rate of pay and they're standing there handing out a carton of milk to each kid, I get that. It's like, where's the efficiency?
Yeah, where's the efficiency? And it's just basically learning. So no matter what you know, it's still going to be, how are you going to empower those people to do the work that they have to do?
Yeah.
When I was in the Army, one of the units I was in, our commander had a saying, and he said, people first, mission always.
Yeah. Yeah. And that stuck with you.
Absolutely.
For a lot of years.
Absolutely.
I know when I think we first met, you were still in the reserves and you were carrying the rank of captain, and I used to call you Captain Kirk. Yeah, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
For any Trekkie fan listening.
Yeah, and I've even played Lieutenant Uhura a time.
That's right. Well, a little bird told me recently that there was a pretty serious leadership meeting going on, and all of a sudden you got your wish. You became a stand-up comedian. Yeah. First of all, why did you start cracking jokes? And then I'm going to ask you to tell me what some of those jokes were.
It was kind of a semi-serious topic. We had our legal counsel there who was updating us and taking questions from the field about really, really sensitive topics. And anytime those things happen, you can almost feel the tension that happens in the air, because these are very personal. And sometimes you have people on both sides of the argument, and you have to be respectful there. So I always go back to just humor. And, when the old Reader's Digest says, humor is the best medicine. And so I worked on some material the night before.
Well, let's hear it. What is it?
There was a section in there where one of our directors was talking about artificial intelligence and how we can do it. So I asked a joke. Let me think. What was it? Why does our director of technology hate nature?
I don't know.
Because it's full of bugs.
Oh, boom, boom, right? So.
What is a AI computer's favorite snack?
I have no idea.
Microchips.
Oh. now the crew is cracking up. I would call those HR dad jokes, don't you think? Like HR dad jokes, something like that. So
I thought they were a little bit higher class than that.
So people who were listening, what advice would you give them if they're looking to go to that next level? What do you look for when you're promoting somebody or hiring somebody, aside from situational awareness? I know that's number one in your book.
Yeah. Well, you want to make sure that the person is doing it for the right reason. So what's your reason that you want to do this? And most oftentimes, if people sit down and think about it, they talk about having a greater impact on the organization than possibly they maybe had in their previous role. So if people come with that intention, I think that's a good fundamental start. And then you have to ask some questions about, you talked about, personal integrity. How do you deal with difficult situations? And one of the big things is now you're moving into this and you're going to wear a lot of different hats. So sometimes people come in and they want to be a principal, for example, because they love curriculum and instruction. But what comes with the role of a principal is, hey, now you got to deal with discipline. You have to deal with facilities. You have to deal with parents and parent organizations. You have to deal with extracurricular activities and making sure that you're kind of like a mayor of a little city.
Yeah.
And the mayor of a little city doesn't get to sit in their office and basically spend their day just looking at data.
Yeah. Or just designing curriculum.
Yeah.
Yeah. So learn something and teach somebody else how to do it. I think it was Malachi Pancoast in Breakthrough Coach Training said, the skills that got you this job are not the skills you need to do this job.
Yeah.
And nothing could be more true, I think, than that. I think we've both seen that for sure. So I know you're also a dad. I was teasing you about dad jokes, but I know that you still have a son in high school.
Yep.
How does he keep you balanced in terms of your work and dealing with people?
I really am learning a lot when you talk about the intergenerational things, and trying to be patient, as we all try to be patient, and just understand and have fewer times where I say, do it because I told you to. And, those times do happen probably with everyone. But it's a good segue into understanding like what our youth believe in, what they see sometimes for the future. And I've always found it fascinating, even with students at schools, whenever I have the opportunity to go out, is to just ask them a few questions about kind of what do you envision, a future to look like? And hearing some of the things that people talk about, it's mind-blowing. And some of the things that they're able to perceive were kind of like a dream when I was a kid. I would have never perceived that you could have the amount of technology that you have now, pretty much in the palm of your hand, where there's no computer. I remember learning or trying to learn how to type on, manual typewriters, and the speed at which technology has changed our world.
Yeah.
And how much of that, obviously there are some really strong positive aspects to it, but how much of that has taken away from the human interaction that we have. And so when I go back and put that into our young leaders, do we have or are we nurturing people that still have a good understanding, a positive belief system that this is still a people business?
Yeah. I was going to ask you, when you think about and reflect on your work, what brings you back every day, Kirk, that it's kind of like golf, even if you have a bad day at golf, what brings you back? What brings you back to HR every day, knowing that some days it's a grind, some days it's fun, but a lot of stuff behind the scenes.
Sure. Well, what generally brings me back every day is my Alfa Romeo. It kind of brings me back and forth to work there. No, it's what brings me back, I think, is knowing that the work is never finished.
Yeah.
That whatever initiative that I was working on one day, it's going to have to continue. And then that sense of being a part of a team. I was fortunate to work with some really great people, and knowing that you have those people that you can go to, that you can rely on, and knowing that we're all pulling in the same direction, it just brings joy. there are some situations where those things don't happen, and I'm sure in those particular organizations you'll see high turnover rate, or you'll see a greater dissatisfaction in the working environment. So it's just getting back in it and just, chopping down that tree. Hey, just keep swinging the axe a little bit.
Yeah, I think one of the most challenging things for me is we all like to think that we're pretty nice people,
Sure.
but if you wear the title that you have,
Sure.
Chief of Staff, when you walk or just show up in a school or a department or a building, your first clue is when people start backing up, right? I mean, it makes you feel a little weird.
Yeah, or I always like to say when I hear some of those things, I was like, that's not the name that my mother gave me.
So what do you want your legacy to be, Kirk, when it's all said and done? Long career already. How many years have you had in education?
That's a good question. I have to sit down and take my shoes off and count my toes. But I would say for me, honestly, when it's done, that it's just done. It's just done.
You left it all on the field?
Just, I gave it everything that I had. It's done, and it's up to the next generation to kind of write our legacy, because we can't really write it ourselves. I can say, boy, I was terrific at this, or I wasn't so terrific at that. But it's the way that others will remember your legacy. Mm-hmm. is the way we will all be defined.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, I want to thank you for spending some time with us today. Sure. And I also want to thank everyone who was listening or watching. We know there are multiple media outlets out there you can choose from. And I know all of us are issued just a certain number of heartbeats. And so thank you for spending some of those heartbeats with us. And as I always said to my leadership team at the end of a meeting when we were about to hit the road and go do the big work and the important work, rock on with your bad selves.